Okay, folks, again, this is Luke with Cornerstone. We're going to get started here, so appreciate everyone's time this morning and joining us for our, special guest webinar series that we have on Thursdays. We have a great slate for you guys here this morning. We have Dr. Derek Van Amerongen from Humana. He's going to be kind of going over our topic today, which are pharmaceutical costs and how they impact your clients. Part of this series has come from feedback from our broker community on topics and things you guys like to hear about. And we encourage all of you, if there are any other topics that you want to learn more about or hear about in subsequent webinars, please let myself know or let your broker advisor know, and we'll do our best to try to get that on the calendar. A couple housekeeping items here. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, there is a chat box that you can type in your questions, and we will try to go through those throughout the course of the presentation. If not, we will have a question and answer session at the conclusion when Dr. Derek is finished. Many of you have probably seen this slide. We have our broker incentive cruise is slated for May 3rd to May 10th, 2020. We are cruising in the Caribbean. This is for any individual medical, individual ancillary, group medical, or group ancillary, any carriers that you write or sell new business through Cornerstone, those points accumulate. You need 4,000 points, gets you one free trip. 8,000 or more points is 2 free trips. If you have any questions on that, you can check it out at crnstone.com/cruise2020. or also contact your broker advisor for more information. We'd love to see you there. Our resource center, this has recently been updated on our website. This has a lot of information on marketing materials, Q&A on different carrier portals and questions on their benefit packages. It's meant to be an essentially located area, collateral that you can download at your fingertips. And that website is crnstone.com/resource-center. That's information available 24/7, again, at your fingertips. If you have any questions on how to access that, again, please contact your broker advisor. So I want to do a quick introduction here for Dr. Derek. He is the Vice President at Humana and their Medical Officer. He has served as prior National Medical Director for Anthem. He has 6 years of Chief of Obstetrics and Gynecology and was a VP for Medical Affairs for Johns Hopkins Medical Services in Baltimore. He has an undergraduate degree from the prestigious Princeton University and an MD from Rush Medical College in Chicago. We are very excited to have Dr. Derek joining us here today. We really appreciate his time and taking time out of his busy schedule to join us for this webinar series. And so again, we have some great talking points and discussion topics that I think are really pertinent and relevant to our webinar series. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Derek.
Well, thanks so much, Luke, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone today. Thanks to the Cornerstone team for arranging this. And I hope as we go through the presentation, if you have questions, you'll send them in through the chat box so we can respond to those. This is a really timely topic for so many reasons. I'm sure some of you may have seen in the news yesterday that Congress hauled a number of the pharmaceutical executives up to the Hill yesterday to grill them about pharmaceutical prices, especially insulin. I'm sure this is going to be a topic of conversation during the upcoming presidential election. This is the season when we do much of our annual reporting, and I'm sitting down with employers literally every day over the next couple of months to talk about their trends and their cost issues, and certainly pharmacy is always at the top of the list. The reason it's always at the top of the list is because it's the most commonly used benefit, as everyone on this phone knows. It's one that the average person is absolutely going to come in contact, because everyone fills a prescription at least once a year. Happily, very few people get admitted to the hospital or have surgery. But it is important to keep in mind that the portion of the medical dollar that goes to pharmacy is still about 11 to 15%. We still see the bulk of costs coming through inpatient costs more and more and outpatient services. But what people notice and what people respond to, again, is the increasing costs of drugs. What's really driving that increase in costs? It really boils down to specialty drugs. And it's a little bit of a dichotomy there, because by 2020, we expect that at Humana, and I'm sure our experience is going to be replicated across the industry, that more than 50% of the dollars spent on drugs. And when I say drugs, I'm talking about both medical and pharmacy drugs. I don't want to make a distinction, because if you talk to a doctor, I think they tell you a drug is a drug, whether it's IV or sub-Q or PO. More than 50% of the dollars spent on drugs by 2020 will be on specialty drugs. But the dichotomy, as I said, is that represents maybe 1 to 1.5% of all prescriptions. Most of the drugs that the average person will be getting at the pharmacy are what we call small molecules, what a lot of people would call the regular type prescription drugs. And to a certain degree, that battle has been won. Over the last 10 years, 15 years, we've seen drugs that at one time were billion-dollar sellers like Lipitor and Norvasc and many others go generic, and now you can get a day of atorvastatin, which is generic Lipitor, for less than 60 or 70 cents, whereas the brand back in the day was anywhere from $7 to $8. That's been, I think, a huge success for the consumer, and when we look at price trends for small molecules, they are basically flat, and in fact, some years in the past decade, they've actually gone down by a point or two. But what continues to drive costs are the specialty drugs. And another area that is not necessarily thought of as being a specialty, but which is really becoming, I think, an important point of contention, and I think everyone is going to hear a lot more about that over the next few months, and certainly as we get into election season, and that's insulin. Insulin, of course, is used by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. It's a very commonly used drug, and yet we've seen the price of insulin essentially double in the last 5 years. At this point in time, the average person who's using insulin on a regular basis is probably looking at a cost between $1,000 to $1,200 per month just for insulin. And that, of course, is affecting a very large number of people. And I think that's going to be, as I said, a big driver of a lot of the concern about what to do around drug prices as we move forward. So what are some of the tactics that are being proposed at the national level to manage costs? Well, as I said, this topic is becoming, I think, front and center on the national level, which in many respects is reminiscent of what happened in the early 2000s. Those of you who were in the business back then will remember that in the early 2000s, there was enormous concern over the cost of drugs, especially for Medicare members. And you had scenarios like the mayor of Chicago, who was talking at the time about renting a bus and driving to Canada with seniors so they could buy drugs in the Canadian market. That really is a lot of what led to the creation of Part D, which was developed in 2004, 2005, and went into action on 1/1/2006, and really essentially resolved the cost issue for a time for seniors. At this point in time, more than 90% of seniors have drug coverage either through an MAPD or a standalone Part D plan. And so on the small molecule side, that issue has really become a lot less of a concern. However, seniors are facing the same issues with specialty drugs that everyone on the commercial side is facing. So what other approaches are being suggested at the national level to address this? It's important to understand that all of these are embryonic. We're at a very, very early stage in this discussion. It is still highly political. It is also an issue that I think is still being defined. In other words, what do we mean by high drug prices? What is too high? What is a level that reflects the clinical benefit and also defines a value proposition, if you think of value as being that interplay between clinical benefit and cost. And that's the challenge. That's the challenge because many of those very critical factors in the debate have not really been defined. But some of the things that have been proposed, and I think we're going to hear a lot more about them as we move forward, I want to just share some of those. First and foremost is price transparency and direct-to-consumer ads. There has been legislation proposed, and the president has been very vocal about this, to put drug prices in ads so that when you're sitting home at night watching TV, you'll see the ad for Humira or Enbrel or many of the other drugs that are being advertised on TV. Again, most of these are specialty drugs. And at some point during that advertisement, you would see a price. Now, of course, that begs the question, what is that price? Is it the WAC? Is it the AWP? Is it a range? And of course, if you have insurance, that is not at all the price that you're going to see when you go to the pharmacy or when you interact with the specialty pharmacy to have the drug delivered. So a lot of questions about what that means. Interestingly enough, there are a number of stakeholders in the discussion who've come out against that, not just pharma, but others, even medical professional organizations who worry that showing those prices in ads might dissuade people from talking to their physician about these drugs because they would be worried they couldn't afford them. So more to be discussed about that, but that's one thing that's being proposed. Another is benchmarking costs in the United States to international costs. There's been a lot of concern over the last few years, and again, I'm sure everyone is aware of this, that drugs in the United States are typically several times the cost of those same drugs elsewhere in the world, especially in Europe. There is no question that the U.S. market subsidizes costs or prices, I should say, in other countries, because when you go to France or Germany or Britain or Australia, they have very different structures. Many of those countries have price controls. In Britain, they go so far as to say that certain drugs cannot be sold if they don't demonstrate a certain value proposition. And so pharma companies naturally look to the United States with our essentially unregulated system as far as pricing is concerned to recoup those costs and to constitute their margin. There is a metric called the International Price Index, which is a reference point for prices charged in other countries, especially in Western Europe. And the proposal is to benchmark costs in the United States to that. What that would mean, how that would be done, whether that would be leading ultimately to an increase in that IPI to reduce the difference between the United States, those are all questions to be asked. And of course, it doesn't get at the root cause of why are the prices where they are to begin with. Another issue that is already to a certain degree underway in the United States is passing rebates on drugs to the consumer at the point of sale. There are a couple of organizations, PBMs and a couple of health plans that are already instituting pilots to make this happen so that when the member goes to the pharmacy, the member would receive the rebate in some form at the time of filling the prescription. Essentially, the concept is to create the rebate more as a pass-through. That, again, is an interesting concept. Obviously, anyone who's worked in insurance knows that you can just imagine the administrative challenges to doing something like that, especially in a high volume, for a high volume drug. The other questions that would arise from that are, what does that do about the actual price of the drug, and are the rebates being remitted really reflective of either the value of the drug or the actual AWP or net cost that the plan is paying? So again, another idea of ultimately to create more transparency and also get to the issue of rebates. Collateral issue of this is also the proposal that has come out in the last, I would say, month or so to eliminate rebates entirely. And that's something that, interestingly enough, obviously pharma is opposed to, but also AHIP, the America's Health Insurance Plan, the trade organization for health plans, they came out against it as well because of the impact it would have on drug pricing and a lot of the process issues in terms of managing drugs. So again, more to come on that. The last issue that has been implemented recently is changes in the Part D plan to allow from CMS, to allow Part B drugs to have step therapies instituted by health plans. I think this got a lot more attention than it probably deserved. It was, when I read about it in the trades, it really made it sound like this was a major step forward, and it was a major step in the sense that this was the first time that CMS had really moved forward to create a roadmap for using step therapies, but when you look at the utilization of Part B as in boy drugs, that is not really the major cost driver, especially for specialties. And so I'm not sure that that's going to have a significant impact when you start trying to get to the root cause of the increase in specialty drug costs. So, of course, the practical question, and the one I think that's on the mind of probably everyone on this call, is this all sounds great. You know, I have no influence over what happens in Congress or at CMS. So what am I going to do today to help my customers impact drug costs? Because my employers are telling me now that they're under pressure. They're concerned when they look at high-cost claims reports and they see a line item for a drug like Humira. There are 3 people on it, and yet that's a $120,000 line item on an annual basis. A line item which I would say is likely to continue as long as those members are on the plan. So I do have some suggestions, certainly hardly any silver bullets, but some things I want to share. And also, as I said, I'd love to hear some feedback from people on the call about their concerns and questions and observations. The number one tactic is always going to be generics, generics, generics. You know, even though, as I said before, that I think we've won the war, if you will, on small molecules, and I'm doing air quotes here, in terms of the fact that generics are widely available, they're widely used. As I look at employer cost reports, which I'm doing a lot these days as we meet with our customers to do the annual reporting for calendar 18, I still see many customers that are really underperforming in terms of the use of generic drugs. Our benchmarks are that we typically see between 85 and 87% of prescriptions will be for generics. And when I see a customer who is in the high 70s, low 80s, that's good, but it certainly could be much better. One of the metrics that we use informally is that every point of generic use is worth about 70 cents PM. So think about that. So if you go from 84 to 85%, you multiply that by 70 cents times 12 times the number of members in your plan, and that could be some very substantial numbers. Certainly re-emphasizing to members on a regular basis to get those generic drugs, to ask for them, that's really going to be, I think, an important basis for maximizing the cost savings and the value of the plan. It's interesting to me that when I look at our Medicare book of business, because I do a lot of work with our group Medicare programs, the Medicare generic rate is frequently 2 to 3 points higher than commercial, because you're talking about a population that is exquisitely price sensitive. And I've heard some great anecdotes from my colleagues in places like Florida who say that when a generic drug comes to market, they will drive by Walgreens at 7:30 in the morning and see a line of seniors there who are lined up to get their generic version of whatever that brand name is. So we can maximize generics beyond where we are, and I would certainly encourage you to look at that line item, find out where your members are at, consider that this is a really important point of education, and certainly one that we need to come back to on a regular basis. It shouldn't be a one-and-done thing just during open enrollment. Secondly, I would say it's important to research all options for a given drug. You know, what other choices are there besides the one that I'm on or the one that I'm being given? And this is where it's critically important, just like around the discussion of generics, to get the individual member involved. There are some really interesting changes that are happening in the specialty sphere over the next few years. You know, when we talk about generics, it's important to appreciate that a generic drug is by definition the exact same molecule as the brand. So atorvastatin is the exact same molecule as Lipitor. They're identical. And so that's why it's so easy to switch back and forth from a brand to a generic. Specialty drugs, it's important to understand, they're called biologics, and I'm sure many of you have heard that term, and their manufacturing process is very different. It's very complex. In fact, the manufacturing process for a specialty drug is actually patented. It is a patented event, unlike the manufacturing process for a small molecule. And so the point I'm getting at is we will not have true generics in the specialty sphere. What we will have is a group of drugs that are being called biosimilar. In other words, they are very like the branded originator, but they're not exactly the same. The FDA is doing a lot of work to figure out how to express the biosimilarity of drugs. In other words, if you have a drug like Humira, which I'm sure everyone has heard of, it's advertised heavily on TV, and it's for conditions like rheumatoid arthritis. And when you have the biosimilar for Humira, which is coming out tentatively in early 2020, how easy is it for someone to switch from branded Humira to biosimilar Humira? That is, again, something that the FDA will be defining, but the experience in Europe, where many of these drugs have already been on the market for several years, is that that kind of switch can be done fairly easily for most people. And if we're looking at a cost difference in hopefully the 20 to 25 to even 30% net cost differential range, that could mean a very substantial savings, not only for the employer and payer, but also for the individual member who is frequently looking at a co-insurance for these types of drugs. So understanding the options, what else is out there, doing a little bit of research, certainly talking to your trusted advisors at an organization like Cornerstone, talking to your health plan, peeling back the onion a little bit will be really important because as we get more of these biosimilars and other alternatives available, I think there will be an opportunity to bend that trend as far as specialty costs are concerned. Biosimilars are never going to be show us a cost difference like we see in the small molecule side. In other words, 60 cents for a atorvastatin versus $8 for Lipitor. But I think if we could shave 20 to 30% off the cost of some of these very expensive five-figure drugs, that certainly that savings that will ideally go straight to the bottom line. Another option that's important to consider, and this is especially for people who are on chronic medications, is talking to the physician about the role of combination pills. We've seen a big uptick in the last decade, actually the last 15 years, of combination medications, and this was driven by the pharma companies realizing that as many of these, their leading drugs, their best-selling drugs were going generic, one way to deal with that loss of exclusivity was to take that drug, create a combination pill with another drug, and essentially create a third branded agent. And so we see many of the combinations out there, things like Vytorin and Caduet. Those might be names familiar to some of you, where essentially you've got what was a generic drug, or what is a generic drug now, combined with another drug that in fact may itself also be generic, but the combination has a brand name. Many of those can be substituted for with two generic drugs. And again, we see this all the time on the Medicare side. I remind my colleagues that we need to get away from the old-fashioned view of Medicare members as being not terribly tech-savvy. They are frequently very tech-savvy, and they realize when they go online and look up a drug like Vytorin or Caduet, they can see clearly what that is made of, and then realize that instead of a $40 or $60 a month copay for the combination, they could have two $4 copays for the two generics and save themselves a substantial amount of money, especially for people who are on multiple drugs. So understanding what's in a combination pill, again, talking to your physician, which is always a critical part of this process, about what the alternatives are. It's a great way to seek savings. And again, it's something we see routinely on the Medicare side where, again, you're looking at a very cost-sensitive population. As far as specialty drugs, let's go back to that just for a second. This is a challenge because of the cost and what they're used for. Again, specialty drugs are for, very difficult conditions to manage, like rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, hepatitis C. And I don't want to minimize for a second how beneficial many of those drugs have been. I remember a time when we had very little to offer people with rheumatoid arthritis, and now we're seeing people with rheumatoid arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, a lot of conditions that were typically leading to significant disability and even premature death, and you have people who are performing at a very high level and able to do the things they need to do. So these drugs are expensive, but we do have to recognize that their clinical value is really, really important. So we will never be able to get away from specialty drugs, and we probably shouldn't want to because of the benefit they bring to people who have those conditions. But at the same time, challenging cost challenges are going to continue to be with us. Some of the recommendations on a member level that I could share with you is that it's important to know that many manufacturers, in fact, maybe most manufacturers, have member cost assistance programs. And I had someone from Gilead who makes Sovaldi and Harvoni, the drugs for hepatitis C, tell me once that there is virtually no one in the United States who's actually had to pay the co-insurance for those drugs because of the member assistance programs that they have available. So any of your members who are on these drugs, I would highly recommend that for their benefit, they certainly go to the websites of these organizations, the pharma companies, look around for member cost assistance programs and take advantage of those. Now, I'm always a little conflicted to discuss that because at the same time that does nothing for the cost that the employer sees or that the health plan sees, and certainly one of the pernicious effects of things like member cost assistance programs is that in many respects it's painting over the crack in the wall. It's certainly helping the individual member with his or her cost issues in terms of how do I get this drug this month for my problem, but it does nothing to address the larger issue of why are these drugs so expensive and why is it that the costs keep going up. However, just from a humanitarian standpoint, it's certainly important to understand those programs are available. And I've spoken to so many people who work in HR departments over the years who tell me that they certainly have lots of people who come to them and say, I need this drug, I can't afford it, even with, the insurance plan we've got, so what am I going to do? And that is an opportunity. As I said a moment ago, it's important to start asking, especially as we see more and more of these biosimilars come to market over the next 2 years, is there a biosimilar available? We have, in the United States, 4 biosimilars available for some of these specialty drugs. By this time, 2 or 3 years from now, I think that number is going to be in the dozens. This is a large pipeline that is going to be coming to market shortly. A lot of this reflects, as I said, experience that we've already seen in Europe, where many of these drugs have been available for quite some time and led to very substantial cost savings for the systems there. It's also important to ask your doctor for drugs that don't need adjustment periods or titrations. What titration means is that you have to start on a certain dose and then over time increase that dose and then maybe increase it again until you get to a point where you're at the dose that you're going to be on for a maintenance period, in other words, for long term. Some drugs have very complex titration schedules, and the challenge with that is that typically increases cost dramatically. One of the things that some of the pharma companies are doing now is realizing that if they are able to bring a drug to market that does not have that adjustment period, that titration period, first of all, the member can get to the right dose much more quickly, and secondly, there is a cost savings because the member doesn't have to go through multiple doses over a period of time to get to the maintenance dose. The other problem that also creates is the potential for the patient to stop the drug, in other words, non-compliance. And of course, someone who is non-compliant with the drug not only is not getting the benefit of the drug, but also it's really a very significant cost issue because we see the costs not leading to the better outcome that we're all hoping for. And lastly, one thing that we at Humana are always sharing with our members, and I'm sure the Cornerstone team is as well, the opportunity to take advantage of mail order. The savings at mail order are not going to be dramatic, but at the same time, for anyone on a chronic medication where you're taking that medication month in, month out, mail order is a really good option to maximize compliance, in other words, to make it as easy as possible for people to get that medication and stay on it. The costs of non-compliance are very significant to everyone in the system, to obviously the individual, but also to the employer, the payer, the health system, because as people do not complete the medications, do not take them as directed, then they're not achieving the outcomes that we want. And when you look at why people are admitted to the hospital, end up in the emergency room, use services that might otherwise not be necessary. Non-compliance with medication is a big piece of that, and certainly cost is a very grave concern for many people on medications, as we're discussing, and that is absolutely a factor in the rates of non-compliance that we see. So any tools, any processes, any tactics that we can identify to reduce the challenge of compliance, such as making sure that the medications are there on a regular basis and as easy and as time-saving a way as possible, is going to be good, and that's where the advantage of mail order really comes in. So I've gone through a lot of things very quickly. I want to give just a high-level overview. This is a discussion that is going to continue for many months, and one of the things I would certainly encourage everyone on the phone to do is to just pay attention to what you're hearing in the news and the newspaper. This is going to be a hot topic. You may well even have some of your associates come to you and ask you questions about it. It's going to be an interesting process, and I think that the most positive thing I could say is at least the discussion has begun. There aren't any solutions available yet, but hopefully as we move forward and talk about how do we maximize access and how do we make sure that costs, especially for something as popular and as important as drug coverage, remains affordable, I think we'll see some hopefully positive developments over the next 12 to 24 months. So, Luke, let me turn it back to you and ask if there are any questions or any comments from the group.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions here, so I'll try to go through them the best I can. So the first one is, Dr. Derek, in your professional opinion, what do you think the pharmaceutical industry will look like in the next 5 years?
Boy, that's a great question, and I think it's going to depend very heavily on a lot of the things that are happening now at the congressional level. I don't think the industry is headed for any massive shakeout or anything like that. I think the industry's number one concern, and quite frankly it should be, is what is the appetite, not only in Congress, but I would say across the country, for the types of controls and the types of regulations that we see in Europe. In Europe, as I said, you have a variety of different systems, but some common themes are that drug prices have ceilings. Some countries, such as Britain, do not allow drugs to even be sold if the regulating body is not convinced that the drug has value. Other countries require use of certain drugs before other drugs, types of step therapy, and so on. And obviously for pharma, that's a huge issue, because the more regulation that they see, the more it will impact their costs. One of the interesting discussion points from yesterday's congressional hearing, I heard a little bit about it this morning, was the congressional, the Congress people were asking the manufacturers, why are insulin prices so high? Especially because insulin has been on the market for 20 years. And the response was that, well, we need that money for research. That sort of begs the question of, well, if you've got the same product that you've been selling for 20 years, what research are you doing that you need to double the price over the last 5 years? So I don't see any changes in the industry. We've seen a lot of consolidation in the pharma industry. There are many, many companies that existed 20 years ago that are no longer there. But I do think that the way drugs are sold and priced and managed will be very different in 5 years. Absolutely. We probably need to get through the next presidential election and let some of the politics simmer down. But there's no question that this is a very, very high issue for CMS. One of the things that we really didn't discuss, because I didn't want to open this can of worms, is oncology. When you look in the area of specialty drugs, the single largest cost area is oncology. Now, it's one thing to say, what can we do about getting people on biosimilar Humira so it goes from $40,000 a year to $30,000 a year. Meanwhile, every new oncology drug that comes to market is between $15,000 and $20,000 a month. And people are on these drugs sometimes for 20, 30, 40 months. What are we doing about that? And again, that's a great question we could talk about for 8 hours. We don't have 8 hours, do we? Oh, okay. Sorry.
We don't have that much time. No, okay, great. And actually, you killed two of those questions that we had, so I appreciate the elaboration on that. Another one that maybe kind of piggyback off that is we hear about the terminology PBM quite a bit, but I think there's some confusion on exactly what a PBM is and what do they do in that, pharmaceutical, drug costs. Could you maybe explain that a little bit more?
Sure. Well, PBMs are pharmacy benefit managers, and in many respects, and this is, my personal opinion, I have to throw out that disclaimer, I think we're nearing the end of the PBM industry's existence. What PBMs have traditionally been is a third party that manages drugs for either a health plan or an employer, or sometimes for both. In other words, the employer will have the medical coverage with the health plan, and the pharmacy will be managed by the PBM. But what we've seen over the last couple of years, and again, everyone I'm sure is aware of this, is several of the largest PBMs have now been purchased or merged with health plans. You have CVS, who bought Aetna. You have Express Scripts, which was purchased by Cigna. You have Anthem, which is starting its own drug PBM, in other words, internal PBM. Humana has had its own internal PBM forever. We've never used an external PBM. And so, it's essentially just part of our pharmacy department and services. And so I think you're seeing a major move away from the PBM concept, which really was based very heavily on rebates and essentially a black box. And one of the things that we would always say to our customers to encourage them to, keep their pharmacy with us is that our focus has always been on net costs. In other words, how can we write the smallest check possible for that drug, as opposed to focusing on rebates? And as one of our pharmacy directors told me, a while ago, said, be sure to ask your employer, would you rather have a 40% rebate on a $600 drug or a 10% rebate on a $50 drug? So if you're selling rebates, which is really what the PBMs have all been about, it's a little bit of, sleight of hand. Focus on the rebates and don't focus on how expensive the drugs actually are. And some of the things that have been really a challenge for the PBM industry to, reconcile is the fact that they have actually frequently promoted much more expensive drugs to their employer customers than, because of the rebates that the PBM would get. So I think that we're seeing, as I said, the end of the life cycle of the PBM. I think going forward, pharmacy will be part of what health plans do. As you look at, Anthem, Humana, Cigna, Aetna, United. And so this idea of a freestanding entity, I think that's sort of fading away, and probably on balance a good thing. There will still certainly be other issues that need to be dealt with. We talked about some of those in terms of costs and pricing and so on, but I think we're seeing the end of the PBMs as a major stakeholder in medical care.
Great. Brian, thanks for the feedback on that. You talked a little bit earlier on, what can my clients do to control their costs? Do you think, does pharmacy shopping, help out much at all? If I go to like a Walgreens versus CVS versus Kroger, will that move the needle a whole lot for my clients?
I think that's a great idea, and I'm glad you reminded me of that. One of the things that we have on our website at Humana.com, and I would tell you that when we look at the traffic on Humana.com, we get several million hits a month, and probably the plurality of those are for pharmacy. In other words, the number one reason that people come to Humana.com is to look up information about pharmacy. And one of the great things that we have on our website is the ability to look and see exactly what you're talking about, Luke. If I have a prescription for fill in the blank, atorvastatin, simvastatin, whatever, where is it actually going to be cheaper? And of course, that's really important for people with a high deductible health plan who are paying up to their deductible, as opposed to people with a copay. And it's really interesting to see the very significant differences in cost. You'd think it wouldn't vary as much, but it really does. I think it may not be a surprise to anybody that the highest prices tend to be at Walgreens. And again, no aspersions against Walgreens, but it's because Walgreens' business strategy is to go around the country and buy all the corner lots, which are the most attractive geographically. The lowest costs tend to be at the big box stores like Walmart, which don't have as great geographic settings, but they have a lot different perspective in terms of volume. But again, I would definitely use that as a strategy for people, the vast majority of people who are on drugs that are not specialty drugs, who are actually going to be going to the pharmacy. Do some comparison shopping, just like you would do for any other purchase that you'd make. And I think you'll be very surprised and also perhaps very pleased with the differences in the costs. It may mean driving an extra mile out of your way, but to save, 10, 20, 30% on your prescription would really be worth it.
Okay, great. Great, thank you. And again, if you guys have any questions, please put in the chat box. We have a couple others here. I'm going to try to explain these the best I can. Dr. Derek, can you explain how drugs like Prolia work? I have some clients that get it at the doctor's office as a Part B, but other times they get it under Part B. Seems to be something similar with Humira as well.
Well, we probably don't have the ability in this webcast today to get into the specifics on, individual members. And of course, I would never want to do that for PHI reasons. Let me just say at a high level that, certainly any drug that is administered by a healthcare professional, which Prolia is for osteoporosis, and it's also for bone loss due to certain types of cancer. It's an IV that needs to be given by a healthcare professional, either in the doctor's office or an outpatient setting or an infusion setting. It can also be certainly given at home by a home health agent. And I would tell you parenthetically, I think one of the major trends for the next decade, and maybe we should come back and have a discussion on that one day, is the huge increase that I expect to see in home care, up to and including actual therapy and not just IVs and blood pressures, but really very significant things. Any drug that is self-administered is typically considered a pharmacy drug, a Part D as in dog drug, because the individual administers the drug himself or herself. There are some scenarios where you may hear about someone coming into the doctor's office and getting the staff to give him or her a drug, and I hear periodically about people who go into their doctor's office and the doctor or someone on the staff gives the patient the insulin. However, that's not how the FDA classifies those drugs, and those drugs are classified as self-administered pharmacy benefit, Part D as in dog, because of the self-administration. So it's important to understand as you're talking to your physician about treatment that is being proposed, is this something that I need to come here to get? Are you going to write me a prescription? I'll do this at home. Because that line is typically fairly clear between Part B as in boy and D as in dog.
Okay, great feedback. And then another question, kind of slightly different topic. We see this, online vendor more and more. I think a lot of our agents, especially for members that have an HSA, where they're kind of responsible for the full cost of the drug, they hit their deductible, trying to use a website like GoodRx and trying to get coupons for their medications. What do you think is that something that might be advisable for clients to consider as well? And how would that interact with their health plan? And is that, options for them moving forward?
Well, I'm going to be brutally honest with everyone on the call. I think GoodRx has a lot of great things about it. I've had some personal experience with it. I've had anecdotal experience from other colleagues, and it's hard to tell people, no, don't take advantage of a coupon that you can download on your phone and save yourself very significant dollars. I think in this environment, anything that an individual can leverage to maximize savings and reduce drug costs is worth looking into. I don't think that undercuts the pharmacy benefit. I don't think it does anything to subvert what the employer is trying to do in terms of benefit design. GoodRx is not going to be for these really super expensive drugs. It's going to be for a lot of basic, typically branded drugs, and even for some generics. And I would say it's worth looking into for most people.
Okay, great. All right, anybody else have any other questions? Again, please type them in. I guess one other thing, another question that we had here, this is our last question unless we get something else from somebody. What are the biggest concerns that you have in the pharmaceutical industry moving forward?
Well, I think the biggest challenge we have, and this is really a societal challenge, is how do we understand value? And that doesn't apply just to drugs. It really applies to all of medical care. The problem we have in the United States, and actually it's not unique to the U.S., but that's what we're talking about today, is I think there's very little connection between the clinical benefit of the medical care that we receive and the prices we pay. And I think everybody has many personal experiences. You go someplace and, you go to the emergency room and you look at the bill after the fact and they charge you $50 for a Tylenol. And, the idea that you go get a sonogram because you found out your wife is pregnant and that's $800 for an exam that took, 12 minutes. I think if we are able as a profession and as a society to get closer connection between the reimbursement and the outcomes, the services, the performance that we see, I think that we'll actually be a lot happier. I think we'll be a lot more comfortable with the cost of medical care. In the United States, we pay about $3.2 trillion a year for medical care. And when you look at the health status indicators, in other words, what are some, how do we compare with other countries in the world in terms of longevity and neonatal mortality and maternal mortality and the rate of chronic conditions? We're like about 18 or 20 out of the world. And what we pay for medical care is greater than any other country by far. I mean, the closest is Germany, and we pay twice what Germany does. If you told me we pay $3.2 trillion and we are the healthiest darn people on earth, I would say, well, that costs 3.2 to be the healthiest people on earth. The problem is we pay 3.2 trillion and we are way, way down the list. And most European countries, in fact, virtually all European countries, are way ahead of us in terms of health and lifespan and all these other metrics. So how do we get better alignment between that? And I think that, this is going to be a journey. This is going to be a many-year journey. I think we started it with the introduction of the Affordable Care Act, which began our focus on quality and trying to understand, how to actually deliver value. Hopefully, as we learn more, as we become more sophisticated, as we address a lot of the issues we talked about today, we'll continue to make progress. And I'm actually fairly optimistic that in the next, say, 5 to 7 to 10 years, we really will start seeing that value generation in healthcare really accelerate. As we talk about value-based contracting, risk-based contracting, pay for performance, those are all steps along that way. And it's actually, I think, going to be a very exciting time to be involved in this.
Great. Well, that concludes our webinar for today. I really appreciate Dr. Derek from Humana and his time and joining us and sharing some valuable information. And I think a lot of those are great talking points for your individual clients, for your group clients, whatever it might be. We all know that pharmacy is a big hot button item for a lot of our clients we interact with on a daily basis. And I think the more information you kind of arm yourself with to help your clients out the best you can, the better. So again, Dr. Derek, thanks for your time, much appreciated. And maybe we'll try to see if we can't corral him for another webinar at a later date. So thanks again for your time this morning. Appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hope you guys have a great weekend. Take care.